The sun was a hammer over the Arizona Territory in the year of our Lord, 1887. It beat down on the land with a relentless, white-hot fury, cracking the red earth into a web of thirsty fissures and bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy canvas. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was a hot, restless breath that scoured the landscape, picking up the fine crimson dust and carrying it for miles, coating everything in a gritty film. It whispered through the skeletal branches of mesquite and the sharp spines of saguaro, a lonely, mournful sound that was the only true music of this country. A single dirt track, more a suggestion than a road, snaked its way across the plains, a scar of paler dust that connected the distant, hazy mountains to the speck of civilization known as Dust Hollow. It was down this very track that a stagecoach, its paint flaked and its leather cracked, rattled and groaned its way into town, when it shuddered to a halt in front of the livery, raising a cloud of the ever-present red dust. The door swung open. A man in a sweat-stained hat and another with a dusty bowler descended. But it was the third passenger who drew the silent, fleeting glances of the few souls lingering on the boardwalk. She was a girl, though the harshness of her life had tried its best to etch the years of a much older woman onto her face. Her name was Etta, and she seemed to be made of little more than sharp angles and shadows. A worn calico dress, the color of a faded sky, hung on her gaunt frame. Her hair, a common shade of brown, was pulled back in a severe knot, though stray strands had escaped to cling to her damp temples. She stepped down from the coach with a stiff, careful grace, her eyes fixed on the ground as if the dirt itself held a great and terrible secret. In one hand, she clutched a small, worn valise. In the other, she held a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times its creases were soft as cloth. It was a mail-order bride contract, her passage to this place, her last and only hope. Dust Hollow was not a town given to grand welcomes. It was a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled together for comfort against the vast, empty wilderness. A general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung with a tired squeak, a blacksmith's forge, and a sheriff's office with hollow-eyed windows. The silence was thick, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the distant clang of a hammer. Etta stood for a moment, a fragile ship in a hostile sea, before making her way to the mercantile, the paper held out before her like a shield. The proprietor, a balding man named Silas with spectacles perched on his nose, read the contract with a pursed lip. He grunted, adjusted his glasses, and looked Etta over. Ridgehorn Ranch, eh? For Luke. Figured he'd get around to it sooner or later. A man can't live on dust and bitterness forever. He gestured for her to follow him out back to a small buckboard. It's a ways out. Luke, he keeps to himself. The ride to Ridgehorn was a silent one, punctuated by the creak of the wagon wheels and the snap of the reins. The town quickly disappeared behind them, swallowed by the immense, rolling landscape. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was much like its owner, stark, isolated, and built for function, not comfort. A small, sturdy house of rough-hewn timber and a larger barn stood against the backdrop of a rocky ridge that glowed orange in the late afternoon sun. A few wiry cattle watched them from a dusty corral, their tails flicking at flies. Luke was in the corral, working with a young colt on a long rope. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as the mesas that surrounded his land. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were narrowed in concentration. When he saw the buckboard, he didn't stop his work, but his movements became tighter, more deliberate. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. Brought what you sent for. Luke, Silas called out. Luke finished with the horse, gave it a firm pat, and walked over, wiping his hands on his denim trousers. His gaze fell on Etta, and for a long moment, he just looked. A flicker of something, disappointment, maybe confusion, crossed his face. This was not the sturdy, full-figured woman he had half expected, the kind of woman built to endure this land. This was a wisp of a thing, a bird with a broken wing. She looked like the first strong gust of wind might carry her away. She wouldn't meet his gaze, keeping her eyes locked on a loose button on her dress. "This is her?" Luke's voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. "Name's Etta. Papers all in order," Silas said, eager to be done with the transaction. He handed the contract to Luke. Luke took it, his eyes never leaving the girl. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly. He looked back at her, at the way her shoulders were hunched as if expecting a blow. He needed the help. The ranch was too much for one man, and the loneliness was a cancer, eating away at him day by day. He'd told himself this was a practical arrangement. Nothing more. He let out a long breath. "All right, leave her things." Silas did so with haste, and with a final nod. He turned the buckboard around and rattled back toward the fading promise of town, leaving Etta alone with the silent cowboy and the vast, encroaching twilight. "The house needs tending," Luke said. His words clipped. He didn't offer to take her valise. "Kitchen, floors, mending. I'm out most of the day. Supper's at sundown." He turned and walked toward the barn without a backward glance, leaving her to find her own way to the front door. Etta's first night at Ridgehorn Ranch was a trial by sound and shadow. The room Luke had shown her, a small, closet-like space off the kitchen that likely served as a pantry, was suffocating. There was a narrow cot, a single high window with a cracked pane, and the smell of dried herbs and dust. As darkness fell, the world outside came alive with alien noises. The mournful howl of a distant coyote, the sudden, sharp crack of a gunshot echoing from miles away, the frantic barking of Luke's dog by the barn. Each sound made her flinch, pulling the thin, scratchy blanket tighter around her thin shoulders. Moonlight, cold and silver, streamed through the broken glass, casting a single, sharp rectangle on the floor. It felt like a searching finger, and she curled herself into a smaller and smaller ball to avoid its touch. She didn't sleep. She just lay there, listening, her body a taut wire of fear, waiting for a danger she couldn't name but felt in her very bones. In the days that followed, a quiet, uneasy routine began to form. Etta was a tireless worker, a phantom who moved through the house with silent efficiency. The floors were swept. Luke's shirts were mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and simple. Savory meals appeared on the table exactly at sundown. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her answers were always short, clipped phrases. She moved around Luke as if he were a hot stove, careful to never brush against him. Her eyes were always downcast, studying the floorboards, her own hands, anything but the man whose house she now shared. Luke watched her. He was a man of observation, used to reading the subtle signs of weather in the clouds or sickness in a calf. But Etta was a language he did not understand. He found himself irritated by her constant, cowering silence. Yet a reluctant curiosity was taking root. Who was this woman who seemed terrified of her own shadow? One evening, about a week after her arrival, he came in from the barn earlier than usual. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. He found Etta at the dry sink, her back to him, washing the supper dishes in a basin of water. The sleeves of her dress were rolled up past her elbows, revealing slender, pale arms. As she reached for another plate, her left arm turned in the dim lamplight, and Luke saw it. Just above her wrist, peeking out from under a crude bandage of graying cloth, was a dark, ugly stain. It wasn't the clean red of a fresh cut, but the deep, brownish purple of blood that had seeped through and dried. It looked angry and infected. He took a step forward, his voice softer than he intended. "What's that on your arm?" She froze. Her whole body went rigid. Slowly, she turned, pulling her arm back and trying to hide it behind her body. But it was too late. He had seen. "It's nothing," she whispered, her eyes wide and frantic. She finally looked at him, directly at him, and he saw a raw, primal fear in their depths. "Just a scratch, from a nail in the barn." The lie was as plain as the scar on his own cheek. He frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. "That looks more than a scratch. It needs to be cleaned properly. Let me see." He reached for her arm, his intention purely practical. A wound left to fester in this country could kill a person. But his touch never landed. She snatched her hand back as if he'd held a hot branding iron to her skin. "No!" The word was a sharp, panicked cry. She stumbled backward, pressing herself against the wall, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. "I said it's nothing. Leave it be." Luke stopped, his hand still suspended in the air. He was taken aback by the ferocity of her reaction. This was beyond shyness. This was terror. "There's a doctor in town," he said, keeping his voice even. "I can take you in the morning." "No, doctor," she said, shaking her head violently, her eyes darting toward the door as if planning an escape. "I don't need a doctor, please." The last word was a desperate plea, all the fight draining out of her, replaced by a devastating fragility. Her gaze was a wall of ice and fire, warning him away with a fierceness that chilled him. It was the look of a cornered animal, one that would chew off its own leg to escape a trap. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the kitchen stretching between them. He saw not just a frightened woman, but a keeper of painful secrets. He finally lowered his hand and gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, his voice low. "As you wish." He turned and left the kitchen, walking out onto the porch and into the cool night air. The stars were beginning to emerge, cold and distant in the infinite blackness. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the woman in his house was not just a mail-order bride looking for a new life. She was a refugee, running from a past so terrible that even the offer of help felt like a threat. And he, Luke, had just stumbled upon the first thread of it. The days bled into weeks, and the sharp edges of Etta's strangeness began to wear smooth, settling into a predictable, if still silent, rhythm. Luke grew accustomed to the quiet hum of her presence in the house. He would wake to the smell of coffee already brewing and wood smoke curling from the kitchen stove. His clothes, once perpetually coated in a fine layer of red dust, were now clean and neatly folded. The solitary meals he'd eaten for years, often standing over the sink, were replaced by wholesome, flavorful suppers laid out on the scrubbed wooden table. Etta was a phantom of domesticity, efficient and ghost-like, leaving order and comfort in her wake. Yet, she remained a puzzle box with no visible key. The wall she kept around herself was as solid and impenetrable as the rocky ridge that gave the ranch its name. Luke learned the geography of her silence, the subtle shifts in her posture that spoke volumes, a slight stiffening of her spine when he entered a room, the way her hands would clench in her lap if his voice was unexpectedly loud, the constant, unwavering avoidance of his gaze. There were other, stranger things. Sometimes, when he'd pass the kitchen late in the afternoon, he'd find her asleep in a chair for a few precious moments, her mending having fallen from her lap. In that unguarded state of exhaustion, she would sometimes whisper. The words were soft, slurred by sleep, and in a language he had never heard before. It was not Spanish or the German of some of the settlers further north. The sounds were guttural and melodic at once, and though he could not understand a single word, the cadence was always one of sorrow, a lament spoken from a place of deep, old pain. The first time he heard it, he froze in the doorway, feeling like an intruder on a sacred, private grief. He backed away silently, the strange, sad words clinging to him long after he'd returned to the corrals. One blistering afternoon, he came up to the house for a drink from the water pump and found her on the back porch, her back to him. Her thin shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. In her hands, she held a small, rectangular object. He stopped, his boot hovering over the wooden step. He knew he should turn back, give her the privacy she so fiercely guarded. But some protective instinct held him rooted to the spot. The sight of her, so utterly broken and alone, twisted something in his chest. He must have made a sound, a scuff of leather on dirt, because her head snapped up. In a single, fluid motion born of frantic habit, she hid the object in the pocket of her apron. She scrambled to her feet, wiping furiously at her wet cheeks with the back of her hand. When she faced him, her face was a pale, blank mask, but the redness rimming her eyes betrayed her. "I was resting," she said, her voice thick. Luke's eyes flickered to her apron pocket. He could see the faint outline of what he now realized was a photograph, its corners bent and crumpled. "Are you all right, Etta?" "I'm fine," she replied, the words too quick, too sharp. She brushed past him, her head bowed, and disappeared into the cool darkness of the house, leaving him standing alone in the oppressive heat. The image of her silent tears burned into his mind. A new kind of curiosity, sharper and more insistent than before, began to gnaw at him. It was no longer just about her past. It was about the woman herself, the one who cooked his meals and mended his shirts, the one who cried over a hidden photograph and spoke in a language of ghosts. One evening, as they sat on the porch shelling beans into a large ceramic bowl, he decided to try to breach the wall. Gently, "You never speak of where you came from," he said, his voice casual, his eyes on the beans in his hands. He felt her stiffen beside him. The rhythmic snap of the bean pods paused. For a long moment, she said nothing, and he thought she would simply ignore him or get up and leave. But then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I have no home to remember." He glanced at her, a smile, so faint and full of sorrow it could hardly be called a smile, touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. Those remained distant, haunted. It was not an invitation for more questions. It was a statement of fact, a door quietly and firmly closed. He didn't ask again. When Luke rode into Dust Hollow for supplies the next Saturday, he found that the town's curiosity had festered into something uglier. Silence in a woman was unnatural to them, and in the vacuum of facts, they had woven their own dark tapestries of speculation. As he was loading sacks of flour into his wagon, Jebediah, a lanky, mean-spirited ranch hand from a neighboring spread, sidled up to him. "Heard you got yourself a woman out at your place, Luke?" Jebediah said, a sly grin on his face as he spat a stream of tobacco juice near Luke's boots. "A quiet one. Real quiet." Luke ignored him, hoisting another sack. "Some folks are saying she's one of them fallen doves." Jebediah pressed on, his voice louder. "Run out of a cat house in Prescott. Others say she was mixed up in some trouble back east. A trial, maybe, for something bad." Luke set the sack down with a heavy thud, the sound cutting through the lazy afternoon air. He turned slowly and fixed Jebediah with a look as cold and hard as a winter sky. "The woman at my ranch is a decent woman. You'd do well to remember that." His voice was low, devoid of anger, but it carried a weight that made Jebediah's smirk falter. He saw Martha, the storekeeper's wife, watching from her doorway, her eyes wide with gossip-hungry delight. Luke met her gaze, and she quickly ducked back inside. He had drawn a line in the dust. Her reputation was now tied to his, and for reasons he didn't fully understand himself, he would defend it. The storm came 2 nights later. It rolled in from the west, a bruised and angry purple cloud that swallowed the stars and suffocated the moon. The wind rose from a whisper to a roar, shrieking around the corners of the house and rattling the window panes in their frames. Then came the rain, not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof. A deafening crack of thunder shook the small house to its foundations, followed by the sickening sound of splintering wood. Luke was out of his chair in an instant. A large branch from the old cottonwood tree had been torn off and hurled against the roof, punching a hole in the shingles right over the main room. Water began to pour in. "Get the buckets," he yelled to Etta over the roar of the storm. There was no time for silence or hesitation. They worked together in a frantic, desperate dance. Etta, her face pale but her movements swift, brought every basin and bucket she could find while Luke climbed a ladder to assess the damage. "It's a nasty hole. I need to cover it with a tarp, or the whole ceiling will go," he shouted down to her. He scrambled back down, grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the barn, and clambered back onto the slick, treacherous roof. The wind tore at him, trying to peel him from his perch. "I need help holding it down," he yelled. He didn't expect her to follow, but a moment later, she was there, climbing the ladder with a grim determination he'd never seen in her before. Her dress was soaked through, plastered to her thin frame, and her hair had come undone, whipping around her face in the wind. She crawled onto the roof beside him, her small hands gripping the canvas. Together, they fought the storm. They were two small figures battling a force of nature, shouting instructions over the gale, their bodies braced against the onslaught. For those few chaotic moments, there was no past, no secrets, no fear, only the driving rain, the howling wind, and the shared, urgent task of survival. They finally managed to wrestle the tarp over the hole, and Luke began nailing down the edges. As he hammered the last nail, a sudden, violent gust of wind, stronger than all the rest, hit the roof. It caught the loose end of the tarp, turning it into a sail. The force threw them both off balance. Etta cried out as her feet slipped on the wet shingles. Luke reached for her. His own footing lost, they tumbled together, a tangle of limbs, off the low edge of the roof and landed in the soft, rain-soaked mud below. The fall knocked the wind out of him. He lay there for a second, stunned, with Etta sprawled on top of him. Her weight was next to nothing. The world was a blur of noise and motion, the rain lashing their faces, the wind roaring in their ears, and then, for one impossible, suspended heartbeat. Everything went silent. In the chaos of their fall, her face had landed against his. Her lips, soft and cold from the rain, were pressed gently against his own. It wasn't a kiss. It was an accident, a collision, but it was the most profound physical contact he had ever known. He could smell the rain in her hair and the clean, earthy scent of her skin. He felt the light flutter of her breath against his cheek. For that single, infinite second, the storm, the ranch, and the entire hard, lonely world ceased to exist. There was only the startling, unexpected warmth of her mouth on his. They both froze, their eyes wide open. He saw the shock in hers, a mirror of his own. But beneath the shock, he saw something else flicker into life, a spark of raw, unguarded heat. It was a flash of longing, a deep and desperate hunger that she had kept locked away in the deepest recesses of her soul. He saw it, and he knew in that moment that she felt it, too. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The terror slammed back into her eyes like a steel door. With a choked gasp, she pushed herself off him, scrambling to her feet. Her face was ashen in the flashes of lightning. She stared at him for a half-second, her expression a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Without a word, she turned and fled, stumbling through the mud and disappearing into the house, slamming the door behind her. Luke lay in the rain-soaked earth, the cold seeping into his bones. The storm raged on around him, but the silence she had left behind was far louder. He slowly sat up, raising his fingers to his lips, where the ghost of her touch still lingered, a faint, burning trace. He felt hollow, an aching emptiness where that fleeting connection had been. The wall between them had not just been rebuilt. It was now taller and thicker than ever before, and he was left on the outside, more alone than he had ever been in his life. In the aftermath of the storm, a new and formidable silence descended upon the ranch house. It was a cold, brittle quiet, entirely different from the shy, watchful stillness that had preceded it. Etta moved through the rooms like a ghost who had forgotten why she was haunting the place. She was more withdrawn than ever, a ship that had struck an unseen rock and was now pulling back from the shoreline, seeking the deep, empty waters of solitude. Meals were left on the warm stove for him, never on the table. She timed her chores with a painful precision to ensure she was never in the same small space he occupied. If he entered the kitchen, she would find a sudden, urgent reason to be out in the yard, and if he came onto the porch, she would retreat into the house's dim interior. The accidental touch of their lips had not built a bridge. It had blasted a canyon between them. Luke felt her absence as a physical ache, a hollowness in the center of the house that had, to his own surprise, begun to feel like a home. He watched her from a distance, noting the new tension in her shoulders and the way she flinched if he spoke her name, even softly. He saw not an accomplice in a moment of intimacy, but a terrified creature retreating back into a cage he hadn't known existed. It was in watching her painful, deliberate retreat that a profound and quiet truth bloomed within him. He had spent years cultivating his own solitude, building walls around his heart as sturdy as the stone fences that marked his property. He had ordered a bride as a practical matter, a pair of hands to ease his burden. He had not expected this. He had not expected this constant, low-grade thrum of concern, this fierce, illogical need to protect her from the shadows in her own eyes. He replayed the moment in the rain over and over in his mind, the shock in her gaze, but also that fleeting, desperate flicker of life, of a longing that matched his own. He realized, with the simple, irrefutable clarity of a sunrise, that he was in love with her. He was in love with the quiet, hard-working woman who made his bread, the haunted girl who cried over a hidden photograph, and the fierce survivor who had climbed onto a storm-racked roof to help him. He loved not just the woman she was, but the woman he could tell she was meant to be, if only the fear would let her go. This realization did not make him impatient. It settled a strange calm upon him. He would not push, he would not demand. He would simply be there, a steady presence, and wait. His patience yielded a small, fragile result about a week later. The tension had eased from a sharp point to a dull, constant pressure. They were in the barn, the late afternoon light slanting through the dusty air. He was mending a broken harness, his fingers methodical and sure. She was gathering eggs, her movements quiet and graceful. He spoke to the leather in his hands, not to her, so the words wouldn't seem like a confrontation. "You don't have to be scared of me, Etta." She froze by the nesting boxes, her back to him. He continued his work, the rhythmic pull of the awl and thread filling the silence. He thought, for a moment, that she would flee as she always did. Instead, she spoke, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "Fear is a habit." He stopped working and looked at her. She was still turned away from him, a silhouette against the bright opening of the barn door. "I was married once," she said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. Luke remained silent, holding his breath, knowing that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile trust she was offering. It was for 3 days. A long pause stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. He was gone after that. She finally turned, but her eyes looked through him, at a memory he couldn't see. "Then there was a fire. The whole village. It's gone now." And that was all. She gathered the last of the eggs into her basket and walked out of the barn, leaving him with the sparse, terrifying fragments of her past. A 3-day husband, a fire, a home that no longer existed. It wasn't a story. It was a list of disasters, and it only deepened the mystery that surrounded her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, during a task as mundane as any other. Luke had bought a large barrel of salted pork in town, and he was rolling it from the wagon into the house for storage in the pantry, the small, windowless room that served as Etta's bedroom. It was heavy and awkward. As he maneuvered it through the kitchen, he stumbled over a stray rope he used for tying down supplies, a coil he'd carelessly left on the floor. He pitched forward, his arm lashing out to grab the rope to keep from falling. The rope was tangled around the base of the barrel, and the sudden, violent jerk pulled the heavy container sideways. It scraped across the floor with a deafening screech of wood on wood. The iron-banded edge of the barrel caught the corner of a single floorboard right at the threshold of Etta's room. The board, its nails loosened by years of use, flipped up and clattered onto its side, exposing the dark, spider-webbed space beneath the floor. Luke cursed, catching his balance. His eyes fell to the newly exposed cavity. Tucked inside, nestled in the dark earth, was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a piece of dirty, stained canvas. His first thought was that it was a stash of some kind, maybe a few coins saved by a previous owner. He never had a chance to form a second thought. From across the room, Etta moved. It was not a walk or a run. It was a lunge, a desperate, animalistic burst of speed. She crossed the kitchen in a heartbeat, her face a mask of pure, undiluted panic. He had already bent down, his fingers about to touch the rough fabric. "Don't!" she cried, her voice a shredded, broken thing. She threw herself between him and the hole in the floor, her hands outstretched as if to ward off a blow. Her eyes were wild. "Don't pull it!" Her desperate plea hung in the air, thick with terror. Luke froze, his hand hovering over the bundle. Her reaction was so extreme, so violent, that a cold dread washed over him. This was not a stash of coins. This was something she was protecting with her very soul. But her frantic lunge had been too late. The edge of the canvas was already dislodged. As he stared, his eyes adjusted to the dim light of the hole, and he saw what the fabric concealed. The first thing he saw was the glint of steel. It was a knife, a simple skinning knife with a worn wooden handle. The blade was dull, not with age, but with a dark, flaking crust. Old blood. Tucked beside it, a stark and shocking contrast to the grimness of the weapon, was a small, coiled piece of white silk ribbon, frayed at the ends. The world seemed to fall silent. The kitchen, the ranch, the sounds of the day, it all faded away, replaced by the roaring in his ears. The knife, the dried blood, the white silk of a bride, the rumors from town, Etta's story of a husband who vanished, the ugly wound on her wrist, the disparate, confusing pieces slammed together in his mind, forming a picture of such horror that he could barely breathe. He looked from the knife to her face. The fight went out of her all at once. The terror in her eyes collapsed into an abyss of utter despair. Her body, held so rigid with fear, seemed to crumple from the inside out. A sound escaped her throat, a low, guttural moan of pure anguish, as if a dam deep inside her had finally broken. She sank to the floor, her legs giving way beneath her. She landed in a heap, heedless of the exposed floorboard and the terrible secret it had revealed. She buried her face in her hands, and her body was racked with sobs. They were not the silent, shaking tears he had witnessed on the porch. These were wrenching, hopeless sounds of a soul that had been holding itself together by a single thread, a thread that had just snapped. Luke knelt there on the floor, stunned into immobility. His mind reeled. Murderer? Fugitive? Victim? He looked at the weeping, broken woman before him and the grim evidence at her feet. He could have reacted with anger, with fear, with accusation. He could have demanded answers, called her the names the townspeople had whispered. But as he looked at her, he didn't see a criminal. He saw only the crushing weight of her pain. He saw the girl who had climbed a roof in a storm, the woman whose hands were calloused from work, the fragile soul who whispered sad words in a language he didn't know. He saw Etta. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the floorboard back into place, covering the secret once more. He didn't say a word. He shuffled forward on his knees until he was beside her. He hesitated for only a second before reaching out and gently, carefully, pulling her toward him. She was rigid at first, a statue of grief in his arms. He didn't try to soothe her with words. He just held her, offering the silent, solid presence of his body as an anchor in her storm. A violent tremor ran through her, a shudder of resistance, of fear, of a lifetime spent recoiling from touch. Then, with a final, ragged sigh, she surrendered. She sagged against his chest, her strength completely gone. For the first time, she allowed herself to be weak. For the first time, she did not pull away. Her hands, which had been covering her face, came down and weakly clutched at the front of his shirt, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping her from drowning. And Luke just held her, his arms wrapped protectively around her trembling shoulders, listening to her heart break as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor. The days that followed the discovery were draped in a strange, unspoken truce. The terrible secret lay between them, buried again beneath the floorboards. But its presence had changed the air in the house. The fear that had once made Etta skittish and distant was replaced by a raw, fragile vulnerability. She no longer fled from Luke's presence, but instead watched him with wide, questioning eyes, as if waiting for a judgment he never delivered. For his part, Luke moved with a gentle, deliberate care, his every action a quiet reassurance that he was not a threat. He had seen the monster from her past, and in his refusal to run, he had become her unlikely sanctuary. The fragile peace was shattered by the sky itself. Another storm, a cousin to the one that had first thrown them together, rolled across the plains one night. This one was different. It was a slow, brooding tempest, full of low, rumbling thunder that vibrated in the chest and flashes of lightning that illuminated the stark landscape in ghostly, silent tableaus. Neither of them could sleep. The storm seemed to be pulling the tension from the very walls of the house, charging the air with an electric unease. Luke found himself in the kitchen, staring out the window at the rain-lashed darkness, when a soft footfall on the floorboards made him turn. Etta stood in the doorway, a pale figure in her simple nightgown, her arms wrapped around herself. The single kerosene lamp he'd lit on the table cast long, dancing shadows, making the small room feel like the only space in the entire world. "The thunder," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. It wasn't an explanation, it was a confession. "I know," he said, his own voice a low rumble. "It's a loud one tonight." They stood in silence for a long moment, the storm speaking for them. He saw her tremble with each distant roll of thunder, a full-body tremor she couldn't control. On impulse, driven by a need that was deeper than thought, he took a step toward her and held out his hand. It was a simple, open gesture, an invitation. She stared at his hand for what felt like an eternity. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, but it was steady. In the flickering lamplight, it looked like a promise of safety. Hesitantly, as if approaching a skittish colt, she took a step forward and placed her small, trembling hand in his. Her skin was cold. He closed his fingers around hers, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. She didn't pull away. She let out a shaky breath she seemed to have been holding all her life. He drew her further into the room, toward the small circle of warmth cast by the lamp. They didn't speak. Words felt clumsy and inadequate for the space they now shared. He raised his other hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. She flinched at the contact, but leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. Her fear was a palpable thing, a live current running just beneath her skin. But beneath it, he felt a tentative, dawning trust. The gentle touch became a soft caress, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His whispers were as soft as the rain against the glass. He spoke of the land, of the way the sun rose over the ridge, of the colt in the barn. Simple, solid things to anchor her in the present, to pull her away from the ghosts that the thunder summoned. She listened, her head tilted, her body slowly uncoiling from its tight knot of tension. He was not in a hurry. He moved with the slow, patient reverence of a man who had found something precious and was terrified of breaking it. But his eyes, when she dared to meet them, burned with a silent, consuming fire. They held a question, a plea, and a promise all at once. They saw her, not the rumors or the secrets, but the woman who stood trembling before him. And they offered her a world of acceptance in their clear blue depths. Etta was adrift on a terrifying, unfamiliar sea. Every instinct, honed by years of pain and survival, screamed at her to run, to retreat into the safety of her silence. Intimacy had only ever meant pain, a prelude to violation, but this was different. Luke's touch was not demanding, it was offering. His gaze was not one of lust, but of something that looked devastatingly like worship. She was confused, her mind a whirlwind of past terrors and present wonder. And yet, she did not pull away. For the first time, a desperate need for connection, for the solace he was offering, overwhelmed her fear. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not like the accidental, rain-cold touch on the roof. This was deliberate, warm, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, and with a soft, broken sigh. She answered, her lips parting slightly beneath his. The hesitant kiss deepened, becoming a slow, searing exploration. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and unspoken longings, of a shared understanding of pain and a desperate hope for healing. His arms went around her, pulling her flush against his solid frame, and she felt a shudder run through him, a tremor of his own tightly controlled passion. She was so fragile in his arms, yet she felt a strength radiating from him that seemed to seep into her very bones. The trembling of her body did not cease, but its source began to change, shifting from fear to a burgeoning, unfamiliar desire. The kitchen, the storm, the entire world outside their small circle of lamplight dissolved, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the frantic, hopeful beating of their hearts. He lifted her easily into his arms and carried her from the kitchen, through the dark house, to his own room. The journey was a dreamlike passage, with Etta's face buried in the crook of his neck, her hands clinging to his shirt. He laid her on his bed, the scent of clean linen and sun-dried cotton rising around them, and followed her down, in the dim light filtering from the kitchen, under the watchful, silent gaze of the storm. They came together not in a clash of passion, but in a quiet, profound act of mutual surrender. It was a union of scars, a mending of two broken solitudes, both trembling and burning in the wild. Stormy dark. Later, as the thunder gentled to a distant grumble and the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, they lay wrapped in each other's arms. The violence of the storm had passed, leaving a clean, quiet peace in its wake. Etta lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was the most calming sound she had ever heard. "Luke," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm here," he rumbled, his hand stroking her hair. She was silent for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "For the first time in so long, I think, for the first time ever, I feel safe." The simple, devastating power of her words struck him more forcefully than any lightning bolt. He tightened his embrace, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, a silent vow to be the safety she had never known. And in that quiet, peaceful dark, they finally slept. The first thing Luke was aware of was the cold. A draft was coming from somewhere, chilling the air in the room. He reached for Etta, his arm moving through empty space. His eyes snapped open. The spot beside him was empty. The blankets were thrown back. The sun was just beginning to stream through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold morning air. A sick, cold dread, far more chilling than the morning draft, coiled in his stomach. "Etta," he called out, his voice rough with sleep. Silence. He threw the blankets off and was on his feet in an instant. He searched the small house, his calls becoming more urgent, echoing in the empty rooms. The kitchen was just as they had left it. The lamp burned out on the table. Her small room off the pantry was empty. the cot untouched. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. He burst outside. The ground was soft and muddy from the storm, and there, leading away from the porch, was a set of footprints. They were small, delicate, and clearly made by bare feet. They dug deep into the mud, the markings of someone running in frantic haste. His eyes followed the trail. It didn't lead toward the road to town. It didn't lead toward the barn. It led north, straight into the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the Badlands, a place of canyons and scrub, where a person could get lost and never be found. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Had she run from him? Had the light of day brought back the terror, making her regret the intimacy, the trust she had shown? Or was she running towards something? He didn't waste another second. He ran to the barn, his mind a maelstrom of fear. He threw his saddle onto his most sure-footed horse, his hands clumsy and shaking. He cinched the straps, grabbed his rifle from its scabbard, and buckled on his gun belt. Whatever she was running from, or to, the Northern Territory was no place to be unarmed. Within minutes, he was mounted, his heels digging into the horse's flanks. He pushed the animal into a gallop, his eyes locked on the desperate, muddy trail that was already beginning to dry under the morning sun. He rode north, into the vast and dangerous unknown, a silent prayer and a terrible fear warring in his heart. The safety of the night had been a dream. The nightmare of the morning was now terrifyingly real. The trail was a brutal chase against the sun. Luke pushed his horse hard, his eyes scanning the ground, deciphering the story told by the faint impressions in the drying mud. The landscape grew harsher, the rolling plains giving way to a jagged, broken country of rock and thorny scrub. The air was thin and hot, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the clatter of his horse's hooves on loose stone and his own ragged breathing. Fear was a physical thing inside him, a cold knot that tightened with every mile. He was tracking a ghost, a woman running barefoot into a wilderness that could swallow a person whole and leave no trace. After hours of relentless riding, he saw it. At first, it was just a smudge of charcoal against the brown earth, a dark scar in a shallow valley. As he drew closer, the details emerged, stark and grim. It was the skeleton of a small settlement. A few chimneys stood like lonely gravestones, surrounded by the blackened, skeletal remains of timber frames. This was a place that had died by fire. The silence here was different. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of tragedy. He remembered Etta's words in the barn. Then there was a fire. The whole village. It's gone now. This was her home. The footprints led him directly into the heart of the ruins. They were fainter now, sometimes disappearing on patches of hard, sun-baked rock, but he always found them again, a testament to her desperate, straight-line flight. They led him past the ghost of a blacksmith's forge and the collapsed heap of what might have been a small church, its steeple a pile of charred bones. The trail ended at a cabin that stood slightly apart from the others, leaning precariously, half consumed by fire but not entirely destroyed. One wall had collapsed, leaving its interior exposed to the elements. He dismounted, his rifle in his hand, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He moved cautiously toward the ruined structure, every sense on high alert, and then he saw her. She was inside, standing in the one corner of the cabin that still had a roof. Her back was to him. The simple white nightgown was torn and stained with mud. Her bare feet were scratched and bleeding, and her hair hung down her back in a tangled, matted curtain. She was utterly still, her attention fixed on something on the ground before her. Luke followed her gaze and saw a small, crude mound of stones, no bigger than a pillow. It was a grave, unmarked and anonymous. A small, sad monument in a landscape of ruin. "Etta," he said, his voice soft, afraid that any sudden sound might shatter her. She didn't startle. She turned her head slowly, her movements weary, as if she had been expecting him. Her face was a mask of utter desolation, her eyes hollowed out and empty. Stripped of all defenses, the fight was gone. The fear was gone. There was nothing left but a vast, empty plain of pain. "You followed me," she stated, her voice flat and lifeless. "I was worried," he said, taking a slow step into the ruin. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "I woke up, and you were gone." She turned back to the small grave. "This is where it ended, and where it began." She took a deep, shuddering breath. The story, held captive inside her for so long, began to spill out, the words broken and raw, torn from the deepest parts of her. "His name was Jonas," she began. "His family was powerful in these parts. They owned the land, the water, everything. And he wanted me." She said the last word with a chilling emptiness, as if speaking of a commodity. "My father refused. A week later, our well was poisoned. Our stock died. Jonas came back and said he could make it all stop. The price was me." Luke stood frozen, listening to the quiet horror of her words. "He wasn't a man, he was an animal, dressed in a man's clothes. He liked to hurt things, small things, at first, but his appetites grew." Her voice trembled, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture he had seen 100 times, but now he understood its true meaning. The wedding was a nightmare. I stood there in a white dress, feeling like I was at my own funeral. That night, our wedding night, a drifter who had been working for my father, a kind boy named Samuel, tried to help me. He saw the look in Jonas's eyes. He came to the cabin to try and get me away. Tears began to trace clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Jonas found him. He dragged him in here, right here." She gestured to the floor in front of the stone pile. "He used this." Her hand strayed to her apron pocket, where Luke knew she still carried the crumpled photograph. No, not a photograph. A knife. The knife from beneath the floor. He was an artist of cruelty, and he made me watch. Luke felt sick. The image of the crusted blood on the blade flashed in his mind. "When it was over," Etta continued, her voice a dead monotone, "he laid the knife in my hand. He told me that if anyone ever found out, he would say I did it, that I had a lover and we'd conspired to kill him on our wedding night. He was clever. He smeared some of Samuel's blood on my dress. He laughed. He told me I belonged to him now, that my soul was as stained as his." She pointed to the grave. "I buried Samuel myself the next day, while Jonas was in town, celebrating his marriage. 3 days I lived in that hell. On the 3rd night, I took the knife. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd need it to protect myself, or maybe to end it all. I just ran into the hills." Her story came faster now, a torrent of misery. "He hunted me. Not just him, his whole family. They put a bounty on my head. Murderous. They caught me near the border. They didn't turn me into the law. That would have involved questions. They had their own justice." The words caught in her throat. "They kept me for weeks. In a barn. Men, they would come. I learned that there are things worse than dying. So much worse." The ugly wound on her wrist, the way she recoiled from touch, the haunted, terrified eyes. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. "I escaped again. Someone left a door unlocked. A moment of pity. Maybe. I've been running ever since, working odd jobs, sleeping in ditches, always looking over my shoulder, changing my name, trying to disappear. I saw the mail-order bride advertisement, a ranch, far away from everything. A man who kept to himself. It sounded safe." Her voice broke on the last word. She finally turned to face him fully, her eyes pleading, desperate. "I just want to live," she whispered. "Not as a ghost, not as a hunted animal. I just want to be a person. To wake up in the morning and not be afraid. To feel the sun on my face and not worry that it's my last day of freedom. But no one will give me that chance. The world sees the blood on my hands, and they don't care how it got there." Luke's heart felt as if it were being crushed in a vice. He looked at this woman, this impossibly brave survivor who had endured a lifetime of horror and was still standing. He saw the full, devastating scope of her pain, and his love for her deepened into something fierce, primal, and absolute. The town's gossip, the rumors, the evidence of the knife. It was all meaningless dust compared to the truth shining in her tear-filled eyes. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She was stiff for a moment. Then she collapsed against him, her body shaking with a storm of sobs she had held back for years. He held her through it, his hand stroking her tangled hair, his chin resting on the top of her head, offering his strength, his presence, his entire being as a shield against her past. When her tears finally subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths, he gently tilted her face up to his. He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the unwavering conviction in his own. "You want a chance to live like a normal person?" he said, his voice thick with emotion but steady as a rock. She could only nod, a single, heartbreaking tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Then I'm giving it to you," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "Right here, right now. Your past ends today. With me." The sun was setting, pouring through the collapsed wall of the cabin and bathing them in a light the color of blood and fire. In that spectacular, dying light, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound finality and infinite beginning. It tasted of salt and tears, of dust and sorrow. But beneath it all was the unshakable foundation of a promise. It was a kiss that acknowledged every scar, every nightmare, every moment of her pain, and vowed to heal them. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, kissing him with a lifetime of pent-up hope, a desperate, beautiful prayer for the future he was offering. In the ruins of her old life, under the gaze of a blood-red sky, they sealed their commitment. 2 lonely souls forging a new world together. Their return from the ruins marked the beginning of a fragile, precious peace. For 2 weeks, Ridgehorn Ranch became a world unto itself, a sanctuary sealed off from the judgment and ghosts of the past. The terrible secrets, now shared and accepted, lost some of their power. Etta began to unfurl like a desert flower after a rare rain. A genuine smile, small and shy at first, would touch her lips when Luke told a dry story about a stubborn mule. She stopped flinching from his touch, and would sometimes even initiate it, a light hand on his arm, a brief, grateful squeeze of his fingers. The haunted, vacant look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a clear, steady light. She was learning to live in the present, to breathe without fear. For Luke, watching her transformation was like witnessing a miracle. He had never known such profound contentment, a quiet, solid happiness that settled deep in his bones and made the harsh land around him seem full of promise. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them, and its memory was long and venomous. Trouble arrived, as it often did. On the noon stagecoach, in the form of a sealed envelope addressed to Sheriff Miller of Dust Hollow. The letter was written on expensive paper, the script elegant and forceful. It came from a neighboring state and spoke of a fugitive woman named Etta Mae Rourke, wanted for the brutal murder of her husband, Jonas Rourke. On their wedding night, it described her as cunning and dangerous, and mentioned a substantial reward for her capture, offered by the victim's grieving and powerful family. The letter was a lie, but it was a well-crafted one, bearing the weight of official-looking seals and an authoritative tone. For Sheriff Miller, a man who preferred a quiet life and a peaceful town, it was a spark thrown into a tinderbox. The whispers and gossip that had been circulating about Luke's strange bride now had a name and a narrative. Murderess. The word spread through Dust Hollow like a fever, infecting every conversation in the saloon, every transaction at the mercantile. The town's vague suspicion curdled into a righteous, fearful certainty. Luke learned of it when he rode in for supplies. The change was immediate and chilling. Men who had nodded to him for years now turned their backs. Faces in windows were framed with hostile glares. When he entered the general store, the handful of customers fell silent, their eyes on him, full of accusation. Silas, the proprietor, served him with trembling hands, refusing to meet his gaze. Sheriff Miller was waiting for him on the boardwalk. He was a decent man, but a weak one, a man who followed the path of least resistance. "Luke," he said, his face grim, "I need to talk to you. I got a letter about your woman." "She's not a fugitive." "Miller," Luke said, his voice low and hard, his eyes scanning the hostile faces, watching them from the saloon. "The letter says different. It's got official seals. Says she's wanted for murder." "The letter lies," Luke stated, his gaze unwavering. "She's the victim in all this. The family that wrote that letter are the real criminals." The sheriff sighed, shifting his weight. "That may be so, but I'm the law here. I have to look into it. I'll need to bring her in for questioning." "No," Luke said, the word as final as a gunshot. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's under my protection. If you want her, you'll have to come through me." He left the sheriff standing on the boardwalk, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air between them. He loaded his wagon and rode out of town, feeling the weight of 100 hateful eyes on his back. He had drawn his line, not just in front of the sheriff, but against the entire town. He was no longer one of them. He was Etta's. The retaliation was swift and ugly. The next morning, he found it hanging from his front gate. It was the carcass of a stray dog from town, its throat cut. Pinned to its fur with a skinning knife was a piece of crude cardboard with a message scrawled in charcoal. Asterisk, keep the murder bitch and you'll die with her. He cut the poor animal down and buried it, a cold, hard rage solidifying in his chest. When Etta saw his face, she knew. She didn't need to ask. The light that had just begun to kindle in her eyes flickered and dimmed, smothered by the return of a familiar, suffocating fear. The confrontation came 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning to bleed across the western sky. A group of 5 men on horseback appeared on the ridge, their forms silhouetted against the dying light. Luke recognized Jebediah in the lead, his lanky frame hunched with a self-important viciousness. They were all armed with rifles. They weren't a legal posse. They were a lynch mob. Luke had been expecting them. He met them on the porch, his own rifle held loosely in his hands. Etta watched from the window, her face a pale, terrified mask. "We've come for the woman. Luke," Jebediah called out, his voice carrying a false bravado. "Sheriff's too yellow to do it, so we'll do it for him. We don't want a killer living in our county." "I told you once, she's not a killer," Luke said, his voice calm and dangerously even. "And she's not going anywhere. This is your only warning. Turn your horses around and ride away." "We ain't leaving without her," another man snarled, raising his rifle. Luke was faster. He didn't aim at the man. He levered around into the chamber and fired a single, deafening shot into the dirt, 10 feet in front of Jebediah's horse. The animal screamed and reared, nearly throwing its rider. The other horses shied, their ears pinned back in terror. The mob's bravado evaporated in the echoing crack of the gunshot. They stared at Luke, at the cold, deadly promise in his eyes, and saw a man who would not hesitate to fire the next shot into one of them. Jebediah wrestled his horse under control, his face pale with a mixture of fury and fear. "This ain't over, Luke," he spat. "You've made your choice. You and your murdering whore are on your own." He yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back the way he'd come. The others, after a moment's hesitation, followed him, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in their wake. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger truth was undeniable. Dust Hollow, the only home Luke had ever known, was now enemy territory. There was no going back. That night, The house was silent again, but it was the heavy, grief-stricken silence of a death vigil. Etta moved like an automaton, her face utterly blank. She saw the cost of her presence, the life she had ruined, the danger she had brought to the one person who had ever shown her kindness. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the very air from her lungs. Luke awoke near midnight to a floorboard creaking in the kitchen. He was instantly alert, his hand reaching for the pistol he kept on the nightstand. But a sixth sense told him the danger wasn't from outside. He slipped out of bed and moved silently through the dark house. He found her in the main room, a small, shadowy figure by the front door. She was fully dressed in the same worn calico dress she'd arrived in. In her hand, she clutched her small, battered valise. She was leaving. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was going to run again, to disappear into the darkness to save him from her own shadow. "Etta," he said, his voice a ragged whisper in the dark. She froze, her hand on the door latch. She didn't turn around. "I have to go, Luke," she said, her voice choked and broken. I can't let them hurt you because of me. I won't be the reason you end up in the ground." "Turn around," he said, his voice harder now, laced with a desperation she had never heard. Slowly, she turned. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could see the tears streaming down her face. Her expression was one of absolute, heartbreaking resolve. He walked toward her until he was standing directly in front of her, so close he could feel the tremors running through her body. He looked down at her, at the valise in her hand, at the future she was trying to steal from them both. "You think leaving saves me?" he asked, his voice low and intense. He reached out and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You run out that door tonight, and you might as well put a bullet in me yourself. Do you understand that?" She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "There is no life for me here without you," he continued, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "That mob, the town, they don't matter. Nothing matters but you. If you leave, you're killing me. You're taking everything I have and everything I am with you." The raw, undeniable truth of his words shattered her resolve. The valise slipped from her numb fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. She looked into his eyes and saw her own future reflected there, a future that was no longer hers alone to throw away. With a choked sob, she collapsed into his arms, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled around them. He held her for a long time, his own future hanging in the balance. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm with a new, hard-won certainty. "They're right about one thing," he said, his lips against her hair. "We can't stay here." He pulled back slightly, his hands resting on her shoulders. "We'll leave. Together. We'll sell the stock for what we can get, pack what we need, and ride out. We'll go west or north into the territories. We'll find a place so remote they'll never think to look for us. We'll change our names. We'll start over, where nobody knows us." She looked up at him, a flicker of terrified hope in her eyes. "Can we?" "We will," he said, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "It's you and me now. Etta, against all of it, together." In the quiet, moonlit house, surrounded by an invisible siege, they made their plan. They were no longer a lonely rancher and a mail-order bride. They were fugitives, partners, a two-person army preparing to make a stand by running for their lives. They rode for 2 days, pushing west toward the jagged line of mountains that promised anonymity. They moved with a desperate urgency, speaking little, their world compressed to the creak of saddle leather, the thud of hooves on hard-packed earth, and the constant, watchful scanning of the horizon. The ranch, their brief sanctuary, was a memory behind them, and the unknown was a terrifying, hopeful expanse before them. They were traveling light and fast, aiming to cross the Red Creek Bridge by nightfall, a rickety wooden span that was the only passage over a deep, fast-flowing river. It was their gateway to the new territories, their final hurdle before disappearing. The sun was low, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. When they saw the bridge, it was a dark, skeletal line across the churning water below. A sense of relief, fragile and premature, settled over Luke. They were almost there, but as they drew closer, his instincts, honed by a lifetime in a land that offered no second chances, screamed that something was wrong. The air was too still. The birdsong had ceased. He reined in his horse, holding up a hand to stop Etta. "Wait," he whispered. His eyes narrowed, scanning the thicket of cottonwood and willow that clustered at the far end of the bridge. And then he saw it, the glint of a rifle barrel catching the last rays of the sun. The first shot came an instant later. It wasn't aimed at them. It splintered the wooden railing of the bridge just in front of them. A loud, violent declaration. "That's far enough! Rourke's woman!" A voice boomed from the trees. Etta froze, her blood turning to ice. She knew that voice. It was coarse and cruel. A voice from the barn, from the endless dark nights of her captivity. 4 riders emerged from the trees, blocking the far end of the bridge. The man in the lead was broad and bearded, his face a mask of smug hatred. Etta recognized him instantly. Caleb Rourke, Jonas's older brother. "Nowhere left to run," Caleb sneered, his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. "We got the letter you sent. Cowboy, the one to your lawyer, telling him to sell your land, made it real easy to figure out which way you'd be heading." Luke's hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the Colt at his hip. "This is between you and me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let her go." Caleb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She belongs to my family, and you're just the fool who got in the way." The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Luke drew his pistol and fired in a single, fluid motion, forcing the men to scramble for cover. He spurred his horse, pulling at his reins alongside him, wheeling them around and back toward the cover of the rocks they had just passed. Splinters flew from the bridge planks around them. A bullet whined past Etta's ear, so close she felt its heat. They dove behind a large granite outcrop as bullets chewed at the stone, sending chips flying. Luke pushed Etta down, shielding her with his own body. "Stay down," he commanded. He peered over the rock, firing 2 more carefully aimed shots that made the ambushers duck back. "We have to make a break for it," he yelled over the din. "Back the way we came. When I give the word, ride!" He was their only chance. The 4 men were spreading out, trying to flank them. He knew he had to draw their fire, to create a window, however small, for Etta to escape. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. In that fraction of a second, he saw not just fear, but a fierce, protective love that mirrored his own. "Now, Etta, ride!" he roared, and he stood, exposing himself from behind the rock, his pistol barking, laying down a volley of covering fire. Etta's heart screamed in protest, but years of survival instinct took over. She spurred her horse, a sob catching in her throat. She heard a bullet sing past Luke, then another. She saw him flinch. Then, just as she broke from the cover of the rocks, she heard a sickening, wet thud. She looked back. Luke cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and staggered. A dark, ugly stain blossomed on his left shoulder, spreading rapidly across the fabric of his shirt. His pistol fell from his numb fingers. He clutched at the wound, his face going pale, and crumpled to the ground. Time stopped. The sound of the gunfire, the shouting of the men, the pounding of her own heart, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing in the world was Luke, lying motionless in the dust. The animal instinct to flee, the habit of a lifetime, warred with a force that was new and overwhelmingly powerful. To run now would be to leave her heart, her soul, her entire world bleeding to death on the ground. The ghosts of her past screamed at her to save herself, but Luke's face, pale and unconscious, screamed louder. She would not run, not this time. With a cry that was part rage and part grief, she yanked her horse's reins, turning it around and galloping back into the line of fire. Bullets zipped through the air around her. She leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, landing on the ground beside Luke. "Luke!" she screamed, shaking his uninjured shoulder. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The blood was pouring from his wound, soaking into the red earth. She was small, and he was a heavy, solid man, but a desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength surged through her. She grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him, pulling him backward inch by painful inch, away from the open ground and toward a thick, thorny thicket of mesquite bushes. The men, momentarily stunned by her suicidal bravery, renewed their fire. Branches and leaves exploded around her. She felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed her arm, but she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth and pulled, her body screaming with effort, until they were finally concealed within the dense, protective foliage. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it hard against his wound, her hands shaking violently. His blood was all over her, warm and sticky, staining her dress, her hands, her soul. He was dying. They were trapped. Her past had finally caught up to her, and it was going to destroy the only good thing she had ever known. Caleb's voice cut through the brush. "Give it up, girl. You can't hide forever. We'll come in there and drag you out. It'll be worse for you then." Etta looked down at Luke's pale face, at the steady seep of his lifeblood into the dirt. A lifetime of fear, of cowering, of running, coalesced into a single, hard, crystalline point of clarity. Fear had not saved her. Running had only led her here. The only thing that had ever felt like salvation was the man lying at her feet, and they were trying to take him from her. A cold, calm rage she never knew she possessed settled over her. She gently touched Luke's cheek. Then, she reached down and pulled his heavy Colt from the holster still strapped to his hip. She checked the cylinder. 3 shots left. She had watched him practice. She had held the gun herself, felt its weight, its balance. He had tried to teach her. Just in case, this was the case. She took a deep, steadying breath and stood up. She walked out of the thicket, into the open, the heavy pistol held in both hands. The 4 men stared, momentarily speechless. She was a vision of righteous fury, a slight woman in a torn and blood-soaked dress, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes burning with an unholy light. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying across the clearing with an authority that stunned them into silence. Caleb recovered first, a slow, cruel grin spreading across his face. "Look at this. The little mouse is roaring." He started to raise his rifle. "Your last mistake." He never finished the sentence. Etta raised the Colt, the muscle memory from Luke's brief lessons guiding her hands. She centered the sight on Caleb's chest, shut out the world, and squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the explosion deafening in the sudden twilight. Across the clearing, Caleb Rourke staggered backward, a look of pure, dumb shock on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He dropped his rifle, his hands clutching at the wound, and then he fell, a dead weight, into the dust. The other 3 men were frozen, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. They looked at their dead leader, then at the blood-soaked woman who stood as still as a statue, the smoking pistol still leveled in their direction. They had come to hunt a frightened girl. They had found something else entirely. Before another shot could be fired, a new sound cut through the tense silence, the thunder of a dozen horses, coming hard and fast from the direction of town. A moment later, Sheriff Miller and a posse of deputies burst into the clearing. The remaining 3 men threw down their weapons instantly, their hands shooting into the air. The sheriff reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene. Caleb Rourke's body, Luke unconscious and bleeding, and Etta standing over him like a guardian angel of vengeance. "What in God's name happened here?" Miller demanded. But before anyone could answer, another figure pushed his way through the posse. He was an old man, frail and stooped, with watery eyes that held a world of sorrow. He was riding a mule, and he stared at Etta as if he were seeing a ghost. Etta stared back, her own eyes widening in recognition. It was Silas, an old stable hand who had been held captive in the same barn as her, a man who had shown her small kindnesses, slipping her crusts of bread when the guards weren't looking. The old man slid off his mule and pointed a trembling finger at Caleb Rourke's body. "That's one of 'em, Sheriff," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "That's one of the devils who kept us locked up, and this girl—" He turned to Etta, his eyes filling with tears. "This girl ain't no killer. I was there. I saw it. I saw what Jonas Rourke did to that poor boy. Samuel, I saw him put the knife in her hand afterward. She's the victim here. She's always been the victim." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. The old man's words, spoken with a simple, unshakable power of truth, hung in the air, shattering the foundation of lies that had haunted Etta for years. The spell was broken. 2 deputies rushed to Luke's side, applying a field dressing to his wound. Etta finally lowered the heavy pistol, her strength deserting her all at once. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if the old man hadn't caught her. The world spun around her, a dizzying blur of faces, of justice arriving years too late. Later, after Luke had been carefully loaded onto a wagon and was being taken back to the doctor in town, Etta sat beside him, holding his hand. His consciousness flickered. His eyes opened, unfocused and clouded with pain. They found hers. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear. Her entire world narrowed to his battered, beloved face. The nightmare was over. She was free. He was alive. That was all that mattered. "Don't you leave me, Luke," she whispered, her tears falling onto his cheek. "Please, don't leave me." The high mountain valley they chose for their new life was a world away from the flat, dusty plains of Dust Hollow. It was a place of soaring pines, meadows thick with summer wildflowers, and a clear, cold stream that tumbled down from the snow-capped peaks above. Here, the silence was not the heavy, watchful quiet of the desert, but a living, breathing silence filled with a whisper of wind through the trees and the cry of a lone hawk circling in the vast, blue sky. They found a derelict trapper's cabin, its roof caved in and its walls choked with vines, and together, they brought it back to life. They spent a season working side by side, felling timber, mixing daub, and fitting stones for a new hearth. Their shared labor a quiet testament to the life they were building from the ground up. Time, which had once been their enemy, became their friend. The frantic, hunted rhythm of their past slowed to the gentle, deliberate pace of the seasons. Luke's wound healed, leaving a puckered scar on his shoulder that he would carry as a permanent reminder of their trial by fire. But it was the healing of Etta's spirit that was the true miracle of that valley. The haunted, terrified girl who had arrived in Dust Hollow began to recede, replaced by a woman of quiet strength and surprising resilience. The first time Luke heard her truly laugh, the sound was so unexpected it made him drop the axe he was holding. She was trying to shoo a particularly stubborn hen into its coop, and the bird's comical, indignant squawking had drawn a pure, unrestrained peal of laughter from her. It was a sound as clear and beautiful as the water in their stream, and it struck Luke with the force of a revelation. He stood there, watching her with a lump in his throat, and knew that they had truly escaped. She started a garden in the rich soil behind the cabin. She planted rows of beans, squash, and corn, tending to the small shoots with a fierce, maternal devotion. In the act of nurturing life from the earth, she seemed to be nurturing her own rebirth. She moved with a new confidence, her shoulders straight, her gaze no longer fixed on the ground but on the horizon. The nightmares still came, sometimes, waking her in a cold sweat with a silent scream caught in her throat. But now, when they did, Luke was there. He would hold her, his solid presence an anchor in the dark, and whisper to her of the morning to come until the ghosts receded and she drifted back to a peaceful sleep in the safety of his arms. Luke, in turn, found a new purpose. He was no longer just her protector. He was her partner and her teacher. He taught her the language of the wilderness, how to read the tracks of deer in the soft earth and predict the weather from the clouds. He taught her how to ride, not as a means of escape, but for the pure joy of it. He watched with a quiet pride as she transformed from a timid, uncertain passenger to a confident horsewoman, her hair flying behind her as she galloped through the high meadows, a look of exhilarating freedom on her face. He also taught her to shoot. He took her to a quiet clearing, the heavy Colt that had saved their lives in his hand. "A gun is a tool," he said, his voice serious. "And a tool is only as good or as bad as the person who wields it. You should never have to use this again, but you should never again be afraid of it, either." He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing, and when she finally hit the tin can he'd set on a distant stump, a clean, satisfying ping echoing through the forest. She didn't look triumphant. She looked calm. It was the calm of a woman who had faced her deepest fears and taken control of her own power. She was no longer a victim waiting for violence to find her. She was a survivor who had claimed her own strength. One afternoon in late summer, when the valley was bathed in a soft, golden light, they walked down to their favorite spot by the stream, where the water pooled in a deep, clear basin. Etta had woven a crown of wildflowers for her hair, and Luke carried a small, hand-carved wooden box. There were no guests, no preacher, no witnesses save for the ancient, silent mountains. This was a ceremony for them alone. They stood on the grassy bank, the stream murmuring its endless song beside them. There were no grand pronouncements, no formal vows exchanged. Words felt too small for the magnitude of what they had endured and what they had become. Instead, they spoke with their eyes. He looked at her and saw his life, his heart, his entire world. He saw the incredible, unbreakable woman who had walked out of the depths of hell and taught him how to truly live. She looked at him and saw her sanctuary, her champion, the man who had seen the ugliest parts of her past and had not flinched, the man who had offered her not just safety, but a home for her soul. Luke opened the small box. Inside were 2 simple rings, which he had painstakingly hammered and shaped from a single silver dollar. He took her left hand, his calloused thumb gently tracing the faint, silvery scars on her wrist, and slid one of the rings onto her finger. She then did the same for him, her touch steady and sure. And then, standing in the cathedral of the wilderness, they sealed their silent, sacred vows with a kiss of profound peace, of absolute certainty, of a love that had been forged in chaos and tempered in fire. Down in the flatlands, their story had already begun to curdle into legend. Travelers and traders passing through Dust Hollow would sometimes hear the tale, told over whiskey in the saloon or around a lonely campfire under the stars. The details shifted with each telling, the facts blurring into folklore. They didn't speak of Caleb Rourke or the bounty, or of the old man's testimony that had cleared her name. They told a simpler, more dramatic story. They spoke of the quiet, mail-order bride who turned out to be a deadly fugitive. They whispered of how she had shot her own wicked husband dead, and how, on the run, she had saved a reclusive cowboy from a posse, only to vanish with him into the mountains. In the way of all legends, the truth was less important than the tale itself, a story of a dangerous woman, a desperate love, and a violent, wild justice. But up in their high valley, the whispers of the world below were meaningless. They had found what so few ever do, a peace that was earned, a love that was tested, and a life that was truly their own. On that harsh and unforgiving western land, amidst a backdrop of tragedy, prejudice, and bloodshed, something rare and beautiful had been born. It was a love that had been watered with tears, paid for with blood, and finally, gloriously, brought into the light by the simple, unquenchable desire to not just survive, but to truly and fully live. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and say hello. Feel free to share your thoughts on Etta and Luke's journey. And don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier.